I'm Mark Holinshed, and welcome to what is the third episode in the series Henry VIII, The Reign, An Old Tale of Wives. I hope to have set some backstory in the first two episodes, so that in this instalment we can get down to making some real sense of the wildly erratic, if not chaotic, events of the reign of Henry VIII. Now maybe you've gone some way to being persuaded that the man that was Henry VIII was not the all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful tyrant that most history books, fiction books, film and television broadcasts would have us believe he was. A problem with most of the history books, or a problem that I find with most of the history books, is that they are written from the viewpoint of Henry VIII. And then we see the events from his perspective. Taking that view, we come up with Henry decided this and Henry decided that. Henry planned this and Henry planned that. Henry built this and Henry built the other. And Henry was this larger-than-life giant of English history. The most famous king among famous kings. I may have mentioned before now that I don't actually subscribe to that view, and formed an opinion that he was something of a gullible nitwit. And in the first 2 decades of his reign, it was Cardinal Wolsey who ran the show. He ran everything. And he used and manipulated Henry and his wife Catherine for his own purposes. As I would like to show you in this episode, he purposely created Henry's first marriage catastrophe. So, if we may, let's get going. It's July 1521. As we saw previously, Charles V became King of Spain in 1517, and in 1519 was elected Holy Roman Emperor. However, before he could be crowned by the Pope as Holy Roman Emperor, he must first receive the crown of the King of the Germans, specifically at Aachen Cathedral in Germany. He was taking his place on the throne of Charlemagne, on which 31 previous kings, including Charlemagne, had been crowned. Charles had arrived from Spain for his coronation in the summer of 1520, and remained in the Low Countries ever since. The King and Emperor-elect, as we know, had made the perilous journey without incident from the port of Coruña in northern Spain to Flushing in the Low Countries, largely thanks to Cardinal Thomas Wolsey's Treaty of London, which had been agreed in 1518. The treaty, so far at least, had kept Charles's territories of Spain and the Low Countries at peace with arch-enemy France. The Treaty of London had brought Wolsey the unofficial title of the Arbiter of Christendom. Wolsey wallowed in the glory of such an accolade. It had been an honour Pope Leo had aspired to himself until Wolsey stepped in and hijacked his peace initiative. Wolsey, though, had even greater ambitions than this unofficial title. He aspired to all the Pope possessed. Wolsey wanted the Pope's job for himself. The route to the papal office, so Wolsey thought, was through the good grace of Catherine of Aragon's nephew, Charles. The Cardinal had been largely responsible for getting him safely to the Low Countries from Spain in the first place. It was a double-sided plan, and Wolsey would make quite sure his services would be indispensable in getting him back there safely the following year. The Cardinal had been largely responsible for getting him safely to the Low Countries from Spain in the first place. It was a double-sided plan, but then in the summer of 1521 trouble broke out in Christendom, both in the north and the south. Almost simultaneously there were flare-ups in Luxembourg and also south on the Spanish border at Navarre. Francis blamed Charles, who in turn blamed Francis. Suddenly, Wolsey's peace treaty was in jeopardy, and as a consequence, so was Charles's safe return to Spain. The Arbiter of Christendom was soon into action and set off to arbitrate. This time the venue was Calais. The Cardinal arrived in Calais on the 2nd of August 1521 and began by meeting with the French. He had brought with him the King's Great Seal and a team of the most senior of privy councillors. When he fell from grace some years later, Wolsey was accused of using the Great Seal of England without the knowledge of his sovereign, which was probably true. After all, one of his other unofficial titles was the Alter Rex, which translates from Latin as the other king. On the 12th of August 1521, the Cardinal surprised everyone and broke from his mediation and travelled with great pomp to meet Charles at Bruges. Indeed, so much show and grandeur that it took him 3 days to complete the 60-mile journey. In Bruges, Wolsey embroiled himself and his sovereign in an arrogant, selfish, egocentric and conceited abuse of power, the consequences of which still resonate today. He entered into the Treaty of Bruges. This is a copy of the original treaty, and this is a modernised transcript of it. In summary, it was agreed that England would aid the Emperor if he were attacked, and vice versa. In addition, Wolsey, by way of the King's Navy, he would provide safe cover and armed protection for Charles's return to Spain via England the following year, 1522. Okay, straightforward enough, nothing sinister there, but there are other things in this treaty which are devious. It was contracted between the two parties that Charles would marry Henry VIII's daughter, Princess Mary, by proxy when she reached the age of 12. At this time she was just 6 and already betrothed to King Francis's son. It was also agreed that when Charles arrived in England the following year, on his way back to Spain, both parties, the Empire and England, would declare war on France. That is to say, England and the Empire would mount an invasion to conquer the Kingdom of France and, to the delight of Henry VIII, reclaim his right, as he saw it, to be King of France, which was a title he already used. Wolsey's reward for embroiling himself, his king and his country in this secret scheme was that Charles would have him, the Cardinal Papal Legate, unofficial Arbiter of Christendom, Alter Rex, made Pope at the next opportunity. Charles was aware that the King of France had already made him the same offer if only Wolsey would pledge England's forces to unite with France against the Emperor. Given, however, that his king, Henry VIII, was Charles's uncle through his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, he much preferred the Emperor's offer. To side with Francis would bring all sorts of problems, not least what to do with Queen Catherine as Queen of England, particularly if her nephew were to become an enemy of England, and worse, an enemy of Wolsey himself. Wolsey could never be king. He never believed for one moment he could. Wolsey could never be an emperor. Again, he never believed he could. But he could become Pope, and he believed he would. And if he revived the papacy to the level of grandeur and the level of power, and the level of authority enjoyed in days gone by, he too would be the most powerful man in Christendom. Any cardinal, any king, and any emperor would bow, nay, grovel, to pay homage to his godly authority. The gravity of the clergyman's dishonesty cannot be overestimated. His machinations plunged his sovereign and country into an upheaval that would become irreversible. Not only had he rearranged the king's daughter's wedding contract, but essentially agreed to rip up the peace treaty of London, and then side with one of the parties against the King of France, who, at that very moment, had his trust placed in Wolsey to act fairly and honestly in brokering a peace agreement to safeguard his French kingdom and its subjects. The clock ticked on, and then eventually the cardinal and his entourage made their way back, in regal style, to the French delegation at Calais. There they had waited, clicking their heels, day after day, waiting for news. The French, understandably, had become suspicious about this extended visit to Flanders. It fell to Thomas More and Thomas Boleyn to convince the French ambassadors, and in turn King Francis, there had been nothing but clarity and honesty in the dealings at Bruges with Charles. Wolsey then also reinforced More and Boleyn's efforts to keep the lid on the situation. He weighed in with assurances, claiming he would prefer to lose his head than see the destruction of the friendship with France he had built up. The lying toad. He blagged that the reason the Duke of Buckingham was executed was because he had opposed Wolsey's pro-French initiatives. But of course, a treaty on paper is worthless unless the actions it calls for are executed. Wolsey's immediate dilemma was the actions called for in this treaty could not begin until spring the following year. Until then, the Treaty of Bruges was unworkable. The autumn was approaching. It was too late in the year to prepare for a major war, and the risks of embarking on a sea passage from the Low Countries to Spain at this time of year were incalculable. So what to do in the meantime to keep the peace between the two most powerful and mutually hostile sovereigns in Christendom? Well, carry on negotiating, or at least be seen to be negotiating. Negotiate like the most holy of holy fathers might be seen to arbitrate. In the meantime, Wolsey would show off his skills, his wisdom, his knowledge, and perhaps even his divinity to both the King of Spain and the Emperor-elect, just as any good pope might do. His immediate concern had to be to preserve the concord until the spring of 1522. The peace talks continued until November, by which time Wolsey could be sure, as winter well and truly set in, the fighting season was over until next spring. It was time to go home. Wolsey could depart with his title, the Arbiter of Christendom, intact. He had fooled the French into believing England was friendly and neutral. That was until the next Maythorn began to flower. Wolsey's bags were packed for him, and as the oracle of Henrican history, Professor J.J. Scarisbrick, MBE, put it, the cardinal was harried by a king who depended on him for the smallest decision in domestic matters, and who had repeatedly called him home, now started arguing with him about the proposed truce. But no matter, with a pledge from Charles that he would be the next pope, the Grand Churchman sailed back to England on the 28th of November 1521. As he was preparing to leave, King Francis, poor chap, instructed his ambassadors to notify the cardinal of his affection for him. Bizarrely, as Wolsey was accepting the accolades from the King of France, he was finalising, dotting the I's and crossing the T's on the Treaty of Bruges with Charles's ambassadors for the destruction of Francis's kingdom the following year. Then, lo and behold, no sooner had he set foot back on English soil, it was announced that the Pope was dead. Yes, dead. On the 1st of December 1521, Pope Leo X died. About that for timing. In fact, Leo died so suddenly that there was no time even to administer the last sacraments. Echoes perhaps of Cardinal Bainbridge's death. Maybe. We can perhaps imagine Charles's reaction, because he certainly was not expecting that to happen, at least not as quickly as it did. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," he may have uttered in his polished German. 999. This was something of an emergency. Whatever had happened to Leo, he certainly had not intended Wolsey to be appointed Pope in anything like the near future. After all, he, Charles, was still in the Netherlands. Wolsey thus far had done nothing to fulfil his part of the bargain. Anyway, the upshot was, once the Emperor had recovered from the shock, he calmly resolved the dilemma. Some people may argue, and may have done at the time, that a secular ruler could not influence the course of a papal election. Well, this one could. Remember this guy? Yes, Adrian of Utrecht, Charles's boyhood tutor, his aunt and latterly his personal advisor, currently serving as his regent in Spain. Yes, the next pope was this Adrian, Pope Adrian VI. At the time of his appointment, Adrian was 63 years old and unlikely to last too long. Wolsey could at least be persuaded that this aged regent of Spain come pope from the Low Countries was merely a subordinate stand-in who could keep the tiara warm for him when the time came. And so that was that, for the time being. The following spring, then, Charles prepared to make his return to Spain. He reappointed Margaret as his regent in the Netherlands on the 15th of April 1522, and left Brussels on the 23rd of May, arrived at Calais on the 26th, crossed to Dover on the 27th, and was met by Wolsey. Who else? Then, as provided for in the Treaty of Bruges, on the 29th of May, war was declared on France. Lavish entertainment followed on the Emperor's arrival at Greenwich, then again at Windsor, with banquets, hunting, tournaments and pageants. Meanwhile, in France, the king was giving an audience to the English herald, Thomas Benot, in Lyon. The unfortunate Thomas, according to some reports, was trembling as he delivered the declaration. He declared that his master bade the French king beware of him, as he was now his mortal enemy, on account of his infraction of the Treaty of Aragon, as follows. 1. By making war on the Emperor and assisting Robert de la Marck, the Signor of Sedan. 2. By employing foreigners, that is to say, Swiss mercenaries. 3. By allowing the Duke of Albany to go to Scotland, and the assumption there was that he was going to stir up problems Scotland against England in the north. 4. By invading Navarre. And 5. By discontinuing his pensions to the King of England and causing the French to pillage his ships. The French king, so the herald reported back to England, without waiting to deliberate with his advisers, denied or refuted all the charges made against him, but he would meet Henry in battle when the time came. So England was placed on a war footing and orders were issued to the Navy with instructions to appoint ships to keep the seas. Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, later Duke of Norfolk, was made commander of both the English and Spanish fleets, and at the end of June he sailed from Southampton west towards Dartmouth in his flagship, the Mary Rose. He had waited at Dartmouth, and by the 1st of July 1522 had sailed across the Channel with his task group on the lookout for maritime threats to Charles's route home. He preemptively attacked the French port of Morlaix and all the French ships moored there. He then sailed to St. Paul Leon and burned the port and the ships there, rendering it completely useless. From there, on to the most westerly port in northern France, Le Conquet, and attacked the town and again burned the shipping. Howard and the Mary Rose had made the way safe, and Charles left England from Southampton for Spain on the 7th of July. Escorted by the English Navy and the Spanish ships, all under English command, the Holy Roman Emperor was soon safely back in Spain, thanks to Wolsey's double dealing. So now Wolsey waited for the death of Pope Adrian, and for Charles then to reward him with a call to Rome to take Adrian's place as pontiff. But how long would Adrian last as Pope before Charles called him to take his place? Well, the answer to that is Adrian would not last long. But getting Charles back to Spain in safety was only half the bargain they'd struck in Bruges. The other half was the invasion of France. Now there came a twist of fate, initially favourable to Wolsey, that should make the invasion considerably less a daunting task. The Duchess, the wife of Charles, Duke of Bourbon, Constable of France, had died. King Francis and his mother Louise claimed the extensive lands that Bourbon's wife had held, and a fierce dispute broke out. By the end of 1522, the animosity between them had driven Bourbon to the edge of rebellion against royal mother and son, and he turned to the enemies of France for aid. So with a noble and rebellious French military commander available and willing to side with them against Francis, Henry VIII and Wolsey moved swiftly. Soon, Bourbon's military skills were with England and Empire against France. The war plan was revised, and it was decided that Emperor Charles's army would invade France from the south, Bourbon would come from the east, and the English from the northwest. And so, at the end of August 1523, led by Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, England invaded from Calais. Just as the invasion was getting underway, came the news that Wolsey had been waiting for. On the 14th of September 1523, in Rome, Adrian, Pope Adrian VI, had died. Surely, now Wolsey's time had come. The invasion went fantastically to plan. Brandon, during the first weeks, had charged over 70 miles into France and crossed the Somme, and by the 2nd of November was less than 60 miles from Paris. On the 30th of October, Sir Thomas More, who was with the King at Woodstock in Oxfordshire, wrote to Wolsey telling him that he had read to Henry the latest incoming royal correspondence. The King, wrote More, who on learning of the great victory at Acre and the victory at Bray, the winning of the passage over the Somme, an unresisted entry into the bowels of France, with the likelihood of his obtaining his ancient right to the French crown, praised Wolsey's industry and zeal in providing the reinforcement of his army, diminished by sickness, and for the supply of money and other things which have brought results he would not have thought feasible. More also wrote that Henry would take Wolsey's advice and go back to Windsor from whence he had just come, accepting in so many words that he had been a bit of a nitwit king by taking such a jolly jaunt into the countryside 50-odd miles from London in the midst of an all-out war with France. However, although the Emperor's army had crossed the Pyrenees, it was camped in poor spirits on the Spanish side of the border, contained there by the French commander Lautrec. Bourbon's rebellious plans had been uncovered, and he fled to Genoa. There would be no attack from the east. In England, Wolsey waited day after day. Then days became weeks. Then slowly, painfully, and then angrily, he realised his time had not come at all. Neither Charles nor the cardinals called Wolsey to Rome. Instead, on the 19th of November, another pope, an Italian pope, became Pope Clement VII. Well, that was Wolsey's lot with the Habsburgs. Despite all his efforts, Charles had humiliated him. His papal ambitions were in tatters. And for now, even worse, he must congratulate the new pope and fake loyalty to the English policy of imperialist friendship which he himself had devised. Now, Henry was oblivious to any change in policy that Wolsey may be contemplating, and he would remain ignorant of it for some time to come. In France, for king and country, for Henry and England, for God and St. George, Brandon had excelled himself as a military leader, and he had acquitted himself magnificently. He was now at Montdidier, just waiting for battering rams to be brought up to the front line. He was ready to take Paris, and probably would have done. Henry VIII knew absolutely nothing about it ever, as we shall see shortly, but Wolsey pulled the rug from under Brandon's feet. Wolsey had supported the Emperor up to now because the Emperor had promised him the papacy. 2 opportunities had now passed. Charles was just as his maternal grandfather Ferdinand had been. He was a damned two-faced liar. So, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, Wolsey severed the money supply to Brandon. The invasion of France collapsed. Wolsey now planned to switch sides and turn French. But how do we know that? Well, that he turned French is a fact anyway, which we'll cover shortly, but that he was personally and secretly responsible for the collapse of the invasion becomes evident some years later as he fell from power. We saw a short while ago that Henry was delighted with the energy and drive Wolsey was putting into organising the invasion, and heaped praise on Wolsey's industry and zeal in providing the reinforcement of his army, diminished by sickness, and for the supply of money and other things which had brought results he would not have thought feasible. The king was equally furious when it all suddenly disintegrated, and his army was reduced to a ragtag mob in retreat to Calais, just as fast as their legs would carry them. So for a moment, let's jump forward to October 1529, when Wolsey was all but done for. The French ambassador, Jean de Bellay, had met with the cardinal and found him in a dreadful state of depression. He wrote back to Anne Montmorency, Marshal of France, suggesting the French royals, who Wolsey by then had long since pledged his loyalty against the emperor. His letter read thus: If the King Francis and Madame Louise, Francis's mother, think it advisable to write to Henry VIII in defence of Wolsey, they will have saved a faithful servant from the gates of hell. But he, Wolsey, begs above everything that his king, Henry VIII, be not informed that they have been asked to do it. For his enemies insinuate that he has always had, both in peace and war, secret intelligence with Madame Louise, from whom during the war he received large presents, and this was the reason why, when Suffolk Charles Brandon was at Montdidier, he, Wolsey, did not help him with money, which would have enabled him to take Paris. So, to return to 1523, and Wolsey now planned to switch sides and turn French. If the Holy Roman Emperor would not make him Pope, he would take the French offer and pledge England's support to them against the Emperor in return for the papacy. In pursuing that plan, which he did with typical determination, he would soon realise, or re-realise, a monumental problem. Henry VIII's wife was the Emperor's aunt. They were close blood relations. The Emperor was betrothed to Henry VIII's daughter. Henry was the Emperor's uncle, and Henry was the Cardinal's sovereign. Wolsey's new archenemy and his sovereign's wife and daughter were all part of the same family. They were not yet England's enemy, but now they were certainly Wolsey's enemy. For this new scheme to work, Wolsey must find a way to irrevocably split up the king, his wife, and her daughter. There was no place in Wolsey's new scheme to become Pope for Catherine of Aragon or Princess Mary. One way or another, he must rid Henry VIII of Catherine of Aragon and her daughter. Moreover, in pursuit of the papacy via the French, Henry would soon need to take a French wife. Never one to tarry, by the spring of 1524, John Joachim, an agent of Louise, the King of France's mother, was in London. Clandestine negotiations were well underway with Wolsey about an Anglo-French alliance against Charles V. Yes, Charles V, King of Spain, Holy Roman Emperor-elect. And this was the beginning of the divorce of Henry VIII from Catherine of Aragon. In the next episode, we'll have a look at how Wolsey fully aligned himself, his king and his country with the French against the Emperor, a consequence of which was that the King of France became a prisoner of Charles V. He was held captive almost to the point of death. The English cardinal turns French, but Henry didn't know. So next time we're heading for the Alps, where Francis met his captive fate at Pavia on the Italian side of the mountains. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.